Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Joshua Shepard about the structure of agency and creative intelligence.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Joshua Shepard, who's the ICREA Research Professor at Autonomous University of Barcelona. Josh's research focuses on issues at the intersection of philosophy of mind and action, psychology, neuroscience, and practical ethics. He's the author of many articles and multiple books, but the one that our conversation will center around today is called The Shape of Agency: Control, Action, Skill, Knowledge, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2021. And that book gives an account of the structure of agency, which we're going to talk about today. And we'll begin with questions about that, but we'll also ask Josh about some of his recent work on the notion of creativity. So welcome to the show, Josh. Thanks for joining us. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to agency?
Yeah, thanks, Taylor, and thanks for having me. It's cool to be here and see you guys again.
Mm-hmm.
You got most of the stuff right in terms of what I work on. I'm an American who lives in Spain, work on those issues in philosophy. I think how I got into agency is that when I started getting into philosophy, started grad school, I was interested in everything. And so I think looking back, it was always going to be like whatever course I took that I loved first was probably going to hook me. Yeah. And I did my PhD at Florida State and took a couple of amazing courses on agency early in my time there. One I remember that Michael McKenna taught, and another Al Mealy taught. I ended up doing my dissertation with Al Mealy as my director. And so I was kind of hooked at that point. And since then, I'm still interested in agency in lots of ways. It's one of those areas where a lot of different currents in philosophy come together. So it's the kind of thing where you can do a little bit of ethics, you can do a little bit of epistemology, you can do a lot of philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and obviously a lot of philosophy of action. And so I think it's one of those areas where there's just a lot of interesting things happening.
Yeah, very cool. Your book, The Shape of Agency, begins with the notion of control. Why is it important to start with this notion? And could you say a bit about the difference between possessing control and exercising it?
Sure. So I don't know if you have to begin with control, but I think that was my road into some of the more traditional questions in the philosophy of action. I think when I started working on the ideas that led to the book, there were ideas about control out there in the literature, but there were a lot of different ways of talking about control, and there didn't seem to be a whole lot of systematic work on the notion itself. So people would talk about intentional control or voluntary control or direct and indirect control and self-control. And there's lots of different ways to modify, the word control. And so I was interested in what control itself might be, whether that was something you could build an account of. And I thought that it kind of seemed at the time, it still seems this way to me, that control is the thing that you exercise, it's the thing that you have that can distinguish the causal effects that we produce through our behavior that are accidental or that are just lucky or that are irrelevant to our goals or our plans or our intentions from the things that we actually intentionally do, the things that might be attributable to us, if you like. So I thought that if we could understand control, we should be able to better understand intentional action. I think possibly we could understand more than just intentional action. And in the book, I try to make the case for some of that. So I think, one way to think of control is as non-deviant causation in action. I try to say a little bit about that in the book. And so I still think the notion of control is really important. And I guess I should say, I wrote the book a few years ago now. And since then, I think it's cool that a number of philosophers have been working more systematically on control. So people like Michaela Kelly or Marcos Volaris or Malte Hendricks. I mean, there's a lot of people that have written interesting recent papers on the notion of control. So that's kind of satisfying to see that other people are taking this up and think that it's a kind of philosophically fruitful concept or notion. About the distinction between possession and exercise, it's a fairly simple one in a way. So it's just the difference between what you can do and what you're actually doing. So I possess control with respect to a lot of things that I might do right now. I can open most of the the lids on the jars in my fridge right now, although I'm not doing any of that right now. I possess control with respect to certain kinds of basic behaviors, walking up and down the stairs and so on. But there's only one or two things I'm usually doing at a time. Right now, I'm exercising control with respect to the words that I'm saying to you and trying to craft coherent sentences and that kind of thing. And so I think when I was building out an account of control for that book, I kind of start with possession and then move to talk about the exercise of control. But you really have to understand exercising control, what that comes to, and then you can understand the possession of control as just the way, the set of like capacities you have to exercise control about a wide range of things that you might do.
Yeah, that's helpful. Well, it's somewhat common for philosophers working on free will to offer accounts of agential control in terms of agents' abilities or dispositions. Could you describe some ways of connecting control with abilities and dispositions and say whether you think control can be understood in terms of these concepts?
Sure. So I say a little bit about this in the book. I mean, I'm not sure that anyone's really taken me up on some of the stuff I say. I'm kind of curious what you all think about some of the stuff I say there, but because I'm a philosopher of action, but I have said precious little about free will in the stuff that I've published, and people make a lot of these notions like abilities and dispositions. So what I say in the book goes something like this. I think some people want to understand ability in terms of the notion of action. So your abilities are, the things that you're able to do, where do there is a kind of like action involving concept. I want control to be more basic than that. I want to explain action in terms of control. I mean, not just control, but control is a central notion in how I want to understand intentional action. So I don't think that if ability is going to involve action, you can use abilities to explain control. I think you can use control to try to explain abilities. Now, of course, the literature on abilities and dispositions pretty sophisticated and technical. So depending on what your account of ability is there, your mileage is probably going to vary. But I do think that I want control to be a more basic notion than an action involving type of ability. Dispositions are a little different. I haven't kept close track of the literature on dispositions in the last few years, but that seemed to me to be a better fit for trying to understand control, because you can think of dispositions as manifestations of some behavior or some behavioral profile given a stimulus. So, I'm disposed to do a range of things. I'm disposed to run if a bear walks into the room. I'm disposed to grimace if my kid punches me in the shoulder or whatever. And so you can understand it as a, stimulus related, or some people, Barbara Vetter sometimes argues that dispositions are just manifestations of behavior without any given stimulus. So you just have to describe the range of cases in which you would manifest this behavior. Mm-hmm. So you can understand control as a kind of restricted application of disposition. So there you could think of control as a kind of set of dispositions to produce behavior that resembles a plan or an intention, given some background. So that's going to be some theoretically interesting range of cases that include a plan or an intention or something like that. So there, the order of explanation would be something like, dispositions are the more basic thing. Control is a kind of way that you can be disposed, and you have to specify the restrictions there. And then you can use control perhaps to go on to explain something like ability. But I offer all that like very tentatively. So I wasn't trying to give an account of abilities or dispositions in the book, but rather just to situate this notion of control with respect to these notions that philosophers have written a lot more about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If I can ask a quick follow-up here. When you talked about possessing control, you mentioned it's kind of like what you can do. And that might sound a little bit like an ability, but maybe you're thinking of that as related to the relevant kind of disposition. And in that case, maybe there might be a distinction between what an agent can do and then some more robust notion of an ability, but you could still have that kind of structure you were just talking about. Is that how you're thinking of it?
Yeah. So I wouldn't want to build too much into that kind of modal language. So, I mean, I at least am comfortable initially thinking of things I can do as some of those would involve action, things I can intentionally do, things I can accidentally do, things I can non-intentionally do. In some sense, I can win the lottery, but I wouldn't want to think of that as an action. So can there is really broad. It's just the kind of range of causal effects that my mind and body might produce when put in the right kinds of
I see.
circumstances. And so
Yeah.
it's like tons of things there, right? And I wouldn't want to assume that has to involve action in every case.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, another familiar idea you find in the free will debate is the idea that agents act with free will when their actions are up to them, so to speak. What do you think it means for an action to be up to an agent?
Yeah, I have no idea, but I'll add some more words to that. So I mean, I think it's an interesting notion. You're right that there's some intuitive sense in which we want to say, like, if I acted freely, what I did was up to me, and then there's a question about whether that notion "up to" can be used to bear more philosophical weight in debates about the nature of agency, the nature of action, the nature of free will. So, I mean, in the book, I was just trying to demonstrate that control could be useful for a lot of different purposes. So I'll say a little bit about what I say there, but I'm not trying to give an account of up to, but suggest how different accounts might go if you want that notion to be more than just a kind of way of talking. If you want it to be a philosophically significant notion. So I try to talk in terms of voluntary control. So the way I think of voluntary control is it's control regarding some kind of plan or goal. So you can kind of reliably and flexibly kind of like conduct the plan, achieve the goal or whatever in circumstances that contain no compulsion or no impediment regarding the acquisition of that plan or the acquisition of intentions that are relevant to accomplishing the goal. So what makes the control voluntary is just that. It's just you're not compelled. There's not any major blocks to you acquiring the relevant intentions. And then when you get the intention, you can go on and exercise the control to do that kind of thing. So then if you're in circumstances where you can say, okay, that you have voluntary control with respect to this goal or this action option or that plan, you reach a kind of philosophical choice point. And it's a very familiar choice point for all your listeners, I'm sure, because you can ask, well, okay, let's suppose that there are no alternative possibilities for action, but you have voluntary control in the sense I just outlined for achieving this particular goal. Can we say that achieving that goal was up to you? And it seemed to me that there's one reading of up to that sounds to my ear, and I'm a fairly boring kind of compatibilist, I suppose, when it comes to free will. So to my very boring compatibilist ear, it seems fine to say that. You had voluntary control. You exercised the control. You did the thing that you planned to do. And so that was up to you. Or you might say, no, that's totally wrong. You've gotten up to wrong. You have to require alternative possibilities. And so while I'm okay personally with the first reading, I didn't want to be doctrinaire because the book wasn't really a book about free will. So I try to articulate this alternative possibilities reading as well to show how the incompatibilists might want to go. So you might want to require not just voluntary control with respect to one option. You should have voluntary control with respect to more than one option at a time. And if you do, and then you go on to do whatever it is that you do, then we could say that's up to you. And so you can build explicitly that notion, alternative possibilities, into the notion. And I suppose what I think about that now is, now this is me, the fact that both readings are available says to me at least that I wouldn't want up to language to bear tons of weight in free will debates. But I say that being a fairly boring compatibilist. So I can hear there's an incompatibilist in my head for sure, and I can hear them complaining about that.
Yeah, that's funny. It does seem like there's something about having studied with Al Mealy that even if you are a boring compatibilist, there's an incompatibilist in your head somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I think that I was an incompatibilist before I started studying philosophy, I think for sure. I remember, late night debates in college, and I didn't do philosophy in college, about this very kind of thing. And then you read a lot and you think a lot and you go to grad school and things happen to your intuitions.
Yeah.
Right.
So for sure, I kind of like became a compatibilist over time, but that doesn't mean I can't remember, the set of like intuitions, beliefs, judgments, whatever that I used to have. So
right, that's great. Well, another thing that you do in your book, especially later on, is you begin by covering various components of agency, including control and intentional action. But then you spend later chapters talking about skill and knowledgeable action, which you take to be excellences. But in between, you give what you call a metaphorical ladder of agency, distinguishing between structural and featural differences of various sorts of agents. And this might be related to some of your other work on consciousness and agents. But could you talk through some of those differences between sorts of agents?
Sure. So I do think that this is an interesting philosophical issue, but it does touch on issues in psychology and in the philosophy of psychology that I'm interested in as well. Because one thing that I thought that I would do when I started to write that book was I'll give an account of all these things, and they'll all be tied neatly together. And one of the things I wanted to give an account of was agency. So I was like, let's give an account of control, intentional action, skill, agency as well. And I don't do that in the book because the more I started to think about the diversity in types of agents that you find out there and the gray areas that you find across the spectrum of kind of biological agents, and now artificial agents are way more in the discussion than they were when I was writing that book. I kind of gave up on trying to give a really clean kind of philosophical analysis of the nature of agency. So yeah, instead of doing that, I kind of just articulate this ladder of agency that's meant to give voice to the thought that when you look out into the world, you see a lot of different kinds of systems that display something like agency. So Tyler Burge, among others, have argued that you find primitive agency at a very low level, single-celled organisms. The paramecia that's like swimming around in some kind of fluid will run into obstacles, and it has a few basic kind of like reactions or dispositions to reorient itself in coherent ways when it runs into obstacles. And looking at that, it's a single-celled organism. It's really quite simple with only a few different kinds of navigational dispositions. It still looks like it's navigating its environment in a kind of agentive way. Now, whether you agree that a single-celled organism can be an agent or not, it at least looks a bit agentive.
Yeah.
Okay. And so then you say, well, what in virtue of what? And so in the book, I say there's a kind of coherence that the behavior displays across different circumstances. And that coherence is coherence with respect to standards. You can offer certain kinds of standards. So if you want to survive and you're a single-celled organism, you want to find nutrients or food or whatever, you should not just continue to do the exact same thing, bump into the obstacle again and again and again. You should kind of like back up, reorient, find a new way. And that's what they do. So at a really basic level, you find systems that start to look like agents when their behavior displays a kind of coherence with respect to standards that you can impose from the outside. These can be standards for survival, standards for the functioning of whatever mechanisms the philosophy of science tells you are crucial to the evolution of this organism or whatever. So you start really basically there, and then you can say, well, what makes it more sophisticated? So how do you move from a primitive agent that's extremely crude to something that's a little more sophisticated? And you can think like an engineer would think, I suppose, and just say, what would it take to build more sophistication into this system? And you find different ways of talking about this. I think some philosophers think that perception is a really critical joint. Some people even say like that's the place at which, if you're really perceiving the environment, you have these representations of the environment as distinct from you, and so you really do at that point get a perspective on reality that you don't have when you're just blindly reacting to sensory stimuli or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so there's different ways of building in more or less sophisticated perception. You can add sensory modalities. You can have multimodal integration across, vision and audition and touch and all these things. And humans and higher mammals have these kinds of things. So perception's one, and then you can also add in more sophistication in what we call cognition, or what we call cognition and motor control. So more sophisticated ways of thinking about the incoming sensory stimuli that perception gives you, and then devising plans for action. And you find this across the animal kingdom as you start to get towards more sophisticated agents, more sophisticated animals. You find more sophisticated cognitive capacities. You find greater integration across their different psychological capacities. And you start to find, when you get up closer to humans, sophistication at the level of planning. So you can take sensory input and you can actually start to devise all sorts of different ways that you could act upon it to satisfy your goals. Another thing, I guess this can go with cognition, but maybe it deserves a separate place, is motivation. So you can just think about sophistication in the range of things you might need or want, or goals you might try to achieve. And so it turns out that human beings, amongst all the other animals, are probably the most sophisticated, certainly amongst the most sophisticated with respect to a lot of these things. Not that we beat all the other animals at every single instance of perception or even cognition, but we just have a wide range of things that we're capable of perceiving, that we're capable of thinking, and that we're capable of doing. So when I get to the later kind of chapters where I'm talking about skill and the role of knowledge in action, I mean, one striking thing about human agents that's different from a lot of other agents is we spend a lot of time thinking about other people. So we design our planning and we design our agency in lots of ways to do things with other agents, to act jointly, to fit into the social world. So social cognition and communication capacities are a big part of what our agency is about. And that gives us just such a wide range of things that we can do. If you're just counting up the action types, the paramecium can do like one or two, and you wouldn't call them intentional actions. It can just orient itself, right? And then you start to add these capacities, and it's crude, but you can start to count all the different actions that different kinds of animals can do with their psychological capacities. And once you get to humans, well, it's like an infinite number of things. We just have to figure out, just give me a trophy for it, and then I'll come up with new ways to invent whole new action domains.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is an interesting thing about the higher end of agency.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we want to turn now to asking some questions about your current project focusing on creativity. What are some components of creative intelligence as you understand it?
Yeah, so let me try to explain this in a way that maybe the people that are into philosophy of agency will like to hear, because I actually got into creativity. Creativity is very interesting. I'm interested in lots of aspects of creativity at this point. I got into it as a philosopher of agency, and so I've been working on a grant for the last couple of years called the Composition of Creative Intelligence. But really, what I'm interested in is trying to understand the nature of creative agency and how to fit that in with other things I think I've tried to come to understand about the nature of agency. So when you think about creativity, artists, performers, even philosophers and scientists, when they're being creative, a lot of philosophers have suggested that there's something distinct about creative agency. It's somehow different from intentional agency. Elliot Samuel Paul is a philosopher who's written about this. He calls it a paradox of creative agency. And the thought is, when you think about paradigm instances of creativity, so think about incubation, where you're in the shower thinking about something totally different, and a creative idea comes out of the blue, okay? And that's a crucial thing for writing your novel or finishing your philosophy article or designing a scientific experiment or whatever. Or you can think about improvisation, when someone's a jazz musician or an improv comedian, and they do a bizarre movement, bizarre way of playing the guitar that surprises everybody, that they didn't see coming, and they surprise themselves. That can be a key moment of creativity. It looks like those are moments with respect to which we're kind of passive. We didn't plan to do exactly that. If we exercise control, it doesn't seem to be the normal kind of control that runs through intentions, because we didn't intend to do exactly that. And a number of philosophers have pointed out that very thing, like creative agency seems to have some distance from planning and control. Mm-hmm. It also seems to be the kind of thing that's agentive in some ways. We praise people for their creativity. It's repeatable in some sense. It doesn't seem purely lucky or purely accidental. Some people are great artists and they continually do these creative things, have these creative ideas. So there's a kind of, at least there's a tension at the heart of creative agency. It seems like agency in some respects, but it seems different from intentional agency, at least. And maybe it seems unlike agency in other respects. And so there's a kind of question there, and I'm kind of working on ways to think about that, and other people are too. And the question is just, where does agency fit into creativity? And is creative agency really fundamentally distinct? Or can we use the tools of action theory to kind of give an account that deflates this and makes it seem a little bit less magical? I mean, going back to Plato, there's one view that says, creativity is not about your agency at all. It's about being taken over by the muses. Mm-hmm. So it's really something else overtakes you. And artists sometimes talk this way. And on the other side, Aristotle had this kind of view. Other philosophers these days are trying to articulate this. It says, no, creativity is really just a set of skills. We just have to articulate the skills right, and you deploy these skills, and then you can do creative things. And I think the truth is probably, interestingly, I wouldn't say somewhere in the middle. I think it's a little bit different from both of those. Mm-hmm. So when I'm trying to understand what creative agency is, I'm trying to understand how to articulate that philosophical tension that I've just tried to articulate here, how to approach it with the tools of philosophy, but then also how to think about it as a philosopher of psychology. Because so, the question you ask is like, what are some of these components of creative intelligence? Well, creativity, like a lot of human action, is a place where a lot of different components or capacities come together. So a lot of people want to talk about imagination and creativity, and certainly the philosophers of imagination have been writing a lot about creativity lately. But it's not just imagination, it's reasoning and inference, it's perception, it's memory. If you're really into like jazz improvisation, there's really interesting work in motor control that I think turns out is relevant to how people are creative with musical instruments. So all those things come together and you get this really kind of interesting set of phenomena. And the question for the philosopher is how to synthesize and integrate that in a way that speaks to other more traditional questions about the nature of agency, the nature of praiseworthiness and creative activity, the nature of creative achievement. I mean, there's a lot there, I think.
Yeah, that's really cool.
It seems like the distinction between direct and indirect control is relevant too. If you think about jazz musicians who've spent years and years and years studying and practicing, and so when the creative mojo takes over and something that happens to them, it's not normal people like me can't just go do that, and it happens to me.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's right, and I think that there's clearly got to be some role for understanding something like a notion of indirect control when you think about creative agency. So you find artists and musicians talk about this. Some philosophers have been tempted to try to give accounts of creative agency that emphasize indirect control, and I think that that's not a bad impulse. I think that there is an open question, and the open question is, okay, so you give a kind of indirect control account of how creative agency works. People do this in different ways. One paper I was reading recently by Antonia Peacock, who's a philosopher I like, she gives a kind of refinement model of creative ideas and how she says you start out with this kind of proto work, and it's a little bit vague, but it gives you some standards for how to move forward, the kind of novel you want to write, the play you want to write, the song you want to write, and then you refine it over time. So you're kind of putting yourself in a position to engage in these actions of refinement. And over time, the indirect control kind of like pushes you into the right place. And I think clearly that's how it works sometimes. I also think that there are these moments where creativity kind of breaks out, and creative agency seems to manifest itself in a way that there might be some indirect control involved, but that it just doesn't seem like that can be the whole explanation. Which is where one is tempted to appeal to the muses or something mysterious like that. My tendencies as a philosopher are usually much more deflationary than that. So I'm interested in trying to understand those moments as well, and what that says about kind of the architecture of the mind, how the mind works, how agency works in a way that could speak to that.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about several different kinds of components of creative intelligence. I wanted to ask too, though, what role, if any, do feelings play in the possession or exercise of creative agency? So, for example, does creativity in action require like feelings of curiosity or feelings of boredom or confidence or any other kind of feeling?
Yeah. I don't think that it requires any of those things. I'm interested in those sorts of feelings. I usually think of them as kind of metacognitive feelings. So feelings that are meant to guide cognition in certain kinds of ways, because there's an indication in the case of curiosity that this line of thinking is promising, or in the case of boredom, that this is not a rewarding way to keep approaching this problem. We got to reframe it or return to it later. Or in the case of confidence, that this thing that I'm thinking, whether it's going to be, this thing I'm perceiving, this thing I'm trying to remember, this line of thought that I'm pursuing is going to work out. These kinds of metacognitive feelings are really interesting in their own right, because I think it kind of speaks to the nature of, not just the nature of thought, the nature of mental action. There's all sorts of subtle aspects of conscious experience that help guide our exercise of mental control, cognitive control. And so I think while I wouldn't require creativity to have any of those particular feelings, I think the explanation of how human beings manage to display creativity, I should say the psychologically realistic explanation of this, is going to appeal to those sorts of feelings, because those sorts of feelings are often really important parts of how we end up solving the creative problems that we're trying to solve when we're trying to be creative.
Yeah. Well, given these ideas about creative intelligence, what are some implications for how we think about artificial intelligence?
So this is, I'm not a philosopher of AI, although I find that lately, I get asked about AI some, and I'm even writing a couple papers that involve AI, maybe in the title or something. I feel guilty about that. I can't, when I give a talk about creativity lately, I will almost never even say anything about whether AI can be creative, and I will still always get the question in the Q&A. Yeah. So can AI be creative?
Right.
I think that understanding how human creativity works has a lot of really important implications for how we think about artificial intelligence. One of those could be just an answer to this question that a lot of people care about: is AI creative, and how is AI creative? Okay. I think a part of the answer to that question has to be like, well, tell me what you mean by creative, mm-hmm. and then I can tell you. We know what AI can do, and we suspect it'll be able to do more in the coming years, so that's fine. Is there something magical about creativity, that is unique to human minds or not? We can learn a bit about that from understanding how human creativity works and what creative intelligence is. But I think there's an interesting, or I find a really interesting set of questions associated with these issues that isn't about whether AI is creative. It's about how our engagement with AI structures and changes our creativity, our creative agency. Yeah. So this is, as like teachers and professors, something we're all probably worried about. How is AI changing not just the creativity, but the ability our students have to think and write and express mm-hmm. themselves? Is it a net win, or is it a net loss, and mm-hmm. and why? In the arts, I mean, this is massive discussions going on, a lot of existential angst. Yes. And some of it's about people losing their jobs. But some of it's about whether something fundamental to human creativity is being kind of lost due to over-reliance on AI that make certain parts of the creative process easier. And then on the other side, there are people that think, no, that's just a kind of Luddite way of thinking. Actually, AI is expanding human creative agency, and there's all this new wide range of possibilities that artists are able to explore. And so AI is going to actually be a big win for human creativity. What I think is that it actually is really going to depend on the details of any given case. So I just think that there's obvious examples you can find of AI undermining, de-skilling human creativity in certain ways. And then there's really interesting things artists are doing with AI that suggest that in some cases it is an interesting kind of scaffolding or enhancement to human creativity. And then there's a range of cases that are in the middle. And to decide what we think about those cases, it helps to know exactly what the AI is doing. How is it? So take something like a creative process, just whatever that is, some abstract process that you normally go through when you're exercising creative agency, and so then you ask, now go through that process, but you're engaging with an AI. Depending on your art, it could be a visual AI, it could be a chat bot, it could be any range of things. How is that process different? And to answer whether it's good or bad for your creativity, that's a value-laden question. So you have to ask things about the value of creativity. But you also just have to understand how the process has been changed. And it might be changed in ways that were not transparent to you before you asked a question like that. So I think that's why asking that kind of question is an interesting thing for a philosopher to do. So I think that there are really rich implications for how we think about the role of AI in human society, how we think about the role of AI in kind of the aesthetic communities that we are trying to build through our artistic practices, that lots of people are writing about now. I think if this was like 3 years ago, I'd be like, no one's talked about this. And now it seems like lots of people are talking about it.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. And it's blowing up. It's an interesting, fruitful area of research right now. Well, thanks, Josh, so much for joining us. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Yeah, they can go to ancient Athens and speak to the oracle, who can deliver them. No, I mean, on Google Scholar or Phil Papers, or those kinds of places are where my work tends to show up, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys. This was fun.
In the next episode, we'll talk about physics and free will with Jeffrey Kapersky, professor of philosophy at Saginaw Valley State University.